A weekend full of action as Formula One experimented with a new sprint weekend format. But ultimately, the race was a bit disappointing as the cars were seemingly finding it difficult to overtake and run close together. Sergio Perez was the driver who took advantage of a cheap pit stop to get ahead of Verstappen, and he looked calm and controlled on his way to take the race win in Baku. But there are some talking points to go through, so here's my 5 things we learned from the Azerbaijan Grand Prix. My name's Andy, and this is Behind the Drive. Perez loves Baku. Sergio Perez has had a great weekend in Baku once again. It seems like the Mexican driver often has great weekends in Azerbaijan as he just loves this circuit. This weekend, he was the driver to take the win in the sprint race, making an overtake on the Ferrari of Leclerc in the process, and then getting past him again in the Grand Prix. It didn't take long in the race for Perez to benefit through the pit stops, with a cheap safety car stop when his teammate had stopped before the window. This was a fortunate turn of events, but beyond that point, he never gave Verstappen a chance. Just before the pit stops, with the medium tyres starting to wear, it actually looked like Perez was closing up to his world champion teammate. And this suggested that Perez was on a level playing field with Verstappen this weekend and could actually find himself nearer the front. After the stops, it was remarkably similar to Saudi Arabia, where Perez controlled his pace at the front of the order and kept Verstappen at arm's length throughout. This was a brilliant achievement for Perez as he made it 2 race wins each for the 2 Red Bull drivers this season. His ability to compete on street circuits in particular is mighty, and it's still an interesting competition at the front. There's no doubt that Perez got slightly lucky this weekend, but once he got to the front, he controlled the pace incredibly well, and I think he did an excellent job to take the win today. Ultimately, this season is a battle between him and Verstappen, and he will need his best performances to compete with the Dutchman, but when you see performances like this, it's clear that he can at least occasionally compete. So obviously it's a green box for Perez for a brilliant showing around the streets of Baku once again. Ferrari show their hand. This was the first weekend of the year that Ferrari managed to show their hand in terms of pace. The team have had a dreadful start to 2023 with reliability issues and communication issues between the drivers and the pit wall. But in Azerbaijan, it was Ferrari that were the team taking the challenge to Red Bull, and for me this is a good thing. It shows that at different types of circuit, Aston Martin, Mercedes or Ferrari could be the team making the leap up to Red Bull, and the fact that they can challenge at different types of circuit might make it more interesting in 2023. Ferrari became the first team other than Red Bull to put their car on pole position this season, as Leclerc was able to take that top spot from Verstappen on Friday and Saturday. It was great to see, but this is similar to what happened in 2022 as Ferrari was stronger in qualifying trim than in the races. Leclerc took more pole positions in 2022 than Verstappen, and there's no doubt that the Monegasque driver is one of the best on the grid in qualifying, but ultimately in the races, the Ferrari was no match for the Red Bull, and Leclerc was a sitting duck in the sprint and in the Grand Prix. Compared to last year at this track, where Ferrari had a dreadful double retirement, and the early season form this year, this weekend was a big step forward for Ferrari. Leclerc has taken a podium for the first time this season, which was a good step for the team. So for me, it's a green box for Ferrari for what was a stronger weekend, but it's all about consistency in Formula One, and this is where Ferrari have struggled so far this year. The gap from the top 4 teams to the rest is evident. The field spread in Azerbaijan was pretty disappointing. This year we have Red Bull significantly out at the front, a group of 3 teams behind them in Ferrari, Aston Martin and Mercedes, and then a relatively competitive order for the other 6 teams behind. This has been the trend all year, but at this track, where straight line speed is really important, it seemed to be exacerbated. After the safety car period, the Red Bulls quickly got back into first and second, and soon enough Verstappen built a 2.5 second gap to Leclerc before the DRS was re-enabled. Subsequently, the 2 Red Bulls immediately cantered off into the distance and built a huge advantage over Leclerc. Behind the top 8 cars from the top 4 teams, there was a huge gap growing between George Russell and Esteban Ocon. It seemed like the drivers would go on attacks and then get into the DRS range, but ultimately find it difficult or even impossible to make overtakes stick, and after a few attempts it became more important to protect the tyre life and ensure those hard tyres could run to the end of the Grand Prix. For the 6 teams outside of the top 4, it seems like there's just 3 points on offer at each race if the top 8 cars finish, so I think we can expect to see a huge gap from 4th to 5th in the Constructors' title this year. What didn't help in Azerbaijan was the fact that the teams pretty much all went for the same strategy. The teams went from the medium compound tyres to the hard compound at the point of the first safety car, and then these hard tyres just looked pretty comfortable. It's a shame to see, considering the circuit is capable of producing some of the most exciting races of any track on the grid, so I wonder if Pirelli could have done better with their tyre selection this weekend. Overall, it's a shame to see some F1 dominance and big gaps all the way down the order, but this is the state we're in at the moment when it comes to the second year of the new regulations. So for me, it's a red box for the gaps in the order this weekend. F1's latest experiment has worked. There was another new, exciting experiment with the sprint race weekend format in Azerbaijan. The Saturday morning FP2, which was only really an opportunity for teams to gather more information on tyre wear, given they couldn't change the setups too much, was actually replaced with the sprint qualifying session. A shortened version of the traditional qualifying with mandated tyre sets in each of the sections. This was an upgrade on FP2 for sure. We've replaced a session which was largely redundant and replaced it with another competitive run. This is definitely an improvement, but there are some things that could have been better. I enjoyed the fact that the teams were forced to use medium tyres in SQ1 and SQ2. This made it different to the qualifying session from the night before, and it meant that the drivers were out on track through the session to get their tyres into the right window. But the need to use new softs in SQ3 had an impact on some of the drivers, given they got themselves into Q3 the previous day. This is something that could definitely be solved in the future by just giving the teams or drivers in SQ3 another new set of soft tyres. In addition, I think the SQ3 session was just too short, or perhaps even too long. The session was 8 minutes, and on this circuit that meant that the teams and drivers were forced to stay out on the soft tyres for their second runs. By this point, the tyre life had diminished, and they were unable to keep up the pace or go quicker on the second runs. So for me, this session could have been just 6 minutes, forcing them into a single run, or extend it to 10 minutes, giving them an opportunity for 2 runs on 2 sets of tyres. For me, the single run in Q3 could be really exciting, putting more pressure on the top 10 drivers in this qualifying format. But really, this session timing is just a simple small point to note on what was overall an improvement in the sprint weekend format compared to last season in my opinion. The Azerbaijan circuit is one that gives teams and drivers a headache when it comes to car setup. The teams need to go with low downforce to get the straight line speed, but also some downforce to manage the tricky castle section in Sector 2. This makes the whole setup decision even more difficult, and this weekend, with just a single practice session to hone the setups, it was more challenging once again. This resulted in some significant differences in the 2 qualifying sessions. George Russell lost out and dropped out in Q2, but was then right up there and even fighting for a podium finish in the sprint. So for me, this weekend format was a great experiment and a positive change from the previous sprint race weekend format. The sprint race itself was a bit average, and it wasn't helped by the fact that the Red Bulls were just so strong when it came to straight line speed this weekend, but for me, the format itself deserves a green box. I enjoyed the fact that the teams had less time on setups and there was more action, and I liked the fact that the sprint race didn't influence the starting order. But let me know your thoughts on this one in the comments. McLaren make a step forward. This weekend was a fascinating one. As I mentioned before, the testing time was limited at best, and given each of the teams had a large break since Australia, there was an opportunity to bring significant upgrades to the cars. This was the case for McLaren as they bought their first upgrade package, which according to Norris was the car that the team should have started the season with. This upgrade gave them at least 0.2 of a second per lap compared with the other teams, and given the competitive nature of the midfield, the McLaren team have gone from a backmarker team to one that is completing at the front of the midfield. The achievements of McLaren were particularly impressive given that shortened test time. They clearly had a good understanding of the changes that they were making, and this meant that they immediately saw a pace upgrade relative to the teams around them. It was a strong weekend, and both McLarens got through to Q3 on Friday, which was a brilliant achievement and a big step forward. In the Grand Prix, the team were close to getting double points, which was a massive achievement considering there were 8 finishing cars that were clearly a step ahead of the team. It seems like Piastri is coming into his own in the first few races of his F1 career, and it was impressive to see how he was performing considering the illness challenges this weekend as well. I've enjoyed watching McLaren's journey so far in 2023. They seem to be in a position to take advantage whenever there are issues ahead, and they're trying to edge ahead of the other midfield teams. And so far, it's working. So it's a green box for their upgrades in Azerbaijan. Honourable mentions. There aren't many honourable mentions today, but I think Alonso had a good race to get ahead of Sainz, and it was a brilliant and opportunistic overtake to make that happen. He has an ability to manage the tyres that really puts him a step above the rest in that front order. To finish 4th in what was a difficult weekend for Aston Martin was very impressive. The other comment to make was on the absolutely dreadful decision from the FIA to put barriers up in the pit lane when Esteban Ocon was still on his way into the pits. The Alpine driver was on lap 50 and had an opportunity to stop. The pit lane shouldn't have been closed and wasn't closed when the Frenchman came in. So why were there photographers and FIA representatives in the pit lane? It was another shocking safety decision that definitely needs to be looked at. So overall, the Azerbaijan race was a bit disappointing. We've seen some great races here in the past, but something needs to change with the tyres if we want to see better racing, in my opinion. Let's hope we have a better race in Miami next weekend.